My name is Don Fry, and in 1948 I was 15 years old and was accepted as a trainee at the Philmont Scout Ranch here. And this was in the summer of 1948. I was a sophomore in high school at that point, and had applied to and been accepted here at Philmont. And they brought us out in the spring of the year for a couple of days of training. Now, at that time, Philmont was using the old Carson Maxwell, and which was Kit Carson's home in Rayado. They housed some of us there while they were teaching us something. I can't remember what. But anyway, we stayed in the old Kit Carson house, which after Kit Carson left, a guy named Jose Abreu, who used it as his home for many years. It's gone now because when Philmont improved the Rayado camp, the building was falling apart, and they built part of the new structures on top of the old Jesus Abreu home. But anyway, we weren't living in tents, at least the young man and myself weren't. They put us in the old what we refer to as the Kit Carson house on the thing. Well, the whole back end of this house was falling down and the roof had caved in, but it did have a bed in it that had springs in the mattress. So we weren't sleeping on a tent on the ground, which was, at that time, seemed rather exciting to us, but that gets old real quick. Anyway, that's how we started out at Philmont before we were taken to the camp that we were actually assigned to. But I got to thinking about, what it meant to be a member of the staff here at Philmont, and the people that might see this video someday. And I've thought about a man that I met through the Philmont Staff Association newsletter. I found a guy that worked, the newsletter gives you the dates and the places that they worked at Philmont for many of the members. And I found just a couple of people that had worked there before 1948. One of them was a guy named Bob Martin. Bob was raised in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and knew Wade Phillips personally when he was in high school. Wade took to him and ended up using Bob Martin. Bob worked for 6 years, first as a horse wrangler and then as one of the camp directors at O'Neill for 6 different years. Bob retired, went into the Air Force as a young man after he'd worked at Philmont, and retired after 30-something years as a brigadier general. I contacted Bob last year, and we sat for many hours over a period of months telling each other our stories about Philmont. And Bob exemplified what I thought the kind of person that you become after you work as a staff member here at Philmont and get the Philmont experience, better than anyone I'd ever heard. And Bob relayed to me every experience he had in the Air Force. He always reported to either a top sergeant or a lieutenant or a captain or a colonel or a general. They read his record and said, "Oh, you worked at Philmont as a young man. We're going to make you, instead of making you a buck sergeant, we're going to make you a top sergeant because you obviously know what you're doing." He said, "All my years in the Air Force, I was always given top-level positions because I'd worked at Philmont." So I said, you can see the value of working at Philmont to Bob Martin, and he exemplifies probably more than anyone else what it means to work here. So that was my experience too. Well, unfortunately, I never had any boy children. I had 5 daughters. They were all Girl Scouts. And although we spent much time up in the mountains of New Mexico where we lived, camping and hiking and such, I never got involved again with the Boy Scouts after my Philmont experience on the thing. So I just had the one summer, 3 months working at Philmont. But it's a memory that has lasted all these years, and reminiscing with Bob Martin about our experiences here at Philmont brought to light how valuable it had been to me to have worked here as a staff member. And I can't pinpoint any ways that it shaped my life, but it certainly shaped it in many, many ways. Yes, I was telling Choate's granddaughter last night about her grandfather's first experience with Bob Martin. And when Bob started working here at Philmont as an acquaintance of Wade Phillips, Choate Phillips was a young man and was freshly out of the military in the Second World War. Wade contacted Bob Martin. He was still in high school at this point, and said, "My son Choate has been in the Army all these years and doesn't know a lot of the back trails to Philmont, and I'd like for you to take him up for several days and show him some of the back trails at Philmont." So Bob said he met Choate at the ranching headquarters where they kept the horses, and said he and Choate got their horses, started getting their horses ready and got their tack ready, and he said got their food together and started preparing themselves to leave to go into the mountains. And he said Choate never had said a word to him. Said he hadn't uttered a sound, which Bob said was kind of strange. But, you know, a lot of people don't talk very much. So he said they started out and they rode all day up into the mountains with him pointing out different trails and intersections to Choate. Said Choate hadn't opened his mouth once, hadn't made a sound. Said they made camp that evening at a pretty place and cooked dinner and got ready for bed, and he said they went to bed, said Choate still hadn't said a word. He said, "We had a good night's sleep. I got up the next morning, Choate was still asleep with his head on his bedroll, and said I started a fire and got a pan and some bacon on the fire and was cooking it, and Choate woke up and came over to the fire and poured himself a cup of coffee, turned to me and started talking. Said it was like almost he couldn't stop. Said he talked all during breakfast. We got our horses ready and got our tack all together. Took off for the next day, is showing him trails, and said he's talking all the time. Bob said, "I never got so tired of hearing anybody talk in my life," but said he talked all the way back to the ranching headquarters when we put our horses up, and said it was like he couldn't stop. And I said, "Bob, what was he talking about?" He said, "Well, he never talked about his Army experiences. Said he just talked about growing up, he talked about Philmont, but mostly he talked about ranching, that he was very interested in getting a ranch started and being a rancher, and the kind of cattle he would raise, the way he would run a ranch. That was mostly what his conversation was about on the thing. But he said, I'll never forget that experience with Choate. We had to bring, the first thing we had to do was bring all the equipment in, because when we first got, well, there were just the two of us, the experienced guy that I'm going to call, we called them rangers at that time, in charge of a small camp like that, and myself, and a mule skinner with about 4 mules with gear and food and stuff for us to set up Uraka with, along with us. So there were just the 3 of us adults and a string of mules. And I can't recall exactly, but I think we had either 4 or 6 burros. And we had cross-tree saddles on them and kayak boxes, where Rudy had taught us how to throw diamond hitches and pack the mules and the donkeys. But we were carrying all the equipment in and our food. And the equipment we had to have, for instance, we had, I remember, 2 5-pound double-pitted axes. Well, we didn't have a sledgehammer. Well, if you've ever worked with a bunch of burros or horses, you know that you either have to put them out to pasture and somehow fasten them, or else you have to keep them in some kind of horse pen. But we didn't have a horse pen at Uraka Cow Camp. All they had was the log building, which was a 1-room building. So anyway, we had bales of hay that Rudy had on his mules to help feed the burros, and we had a lot of rope. Now in those days, everybody uses parachute cord, nylon parachute cord nowadays to set up your tents and tie things together. We didn't have parachute cord in 1948. All we had was small hemp and cotton ropes on the thing. So everything is tied down to our mules and our burros, and we have food for them, but we didn't have any way to put the burros out to grass. We had to build a small enclosure pen to keep them in, and didn't have any picket pins. Now, if you don't have a steel picket pin, you can't stake a horse or a burro out so he can eat grass all day. So we had to make our own picket pin and drive it into the ground out of a piece of wood and pound it into the ground. Well, we didn't have a sledgehammer. But to give you an idea of the kind of simple things that you have to have at a camp like Uraka, we didn't have a sledgehammer. So we had to cut a piece of wood with our double-bitted axe, which if you've ever used an axe, you realize is not the easiest thing to do. Sharpen it and pound it into the ground. Well, the only thing we had to pound it with is the side of a double-bitted axe, which is hard to do. So anyway, we were very short-handed, and the first thing we put on our list when we got to Uraka was we got to have Rudy bring us a sledgehammer. So anyway, after we unloaded the burros and things, we found ourselves at the Uraka log cabin. The Uraka log cabin, the cabin was it. It was empty inside except for a cast iron stove and 2 steel Army surplus separate single spring beds. The floor of the cabin was dirt. It was dust about 2 inches deep. We had no flat boards, nothing flat. There was no table in the cabin. There were no chairs in the cabin. There was nothing to sit on. There was nothing to prepare food or anything. All there was the cabin with a dirt floor. So I'll tell you later on some of our chores trying to make it a livable thing. And as a matter of fact, I brought 2 photographs, which you might want to photograph from the museum, that show pictures of the outside of the cabin. But the cast iron stove at Uraka that was in there was a small cast iron top. It had an oven, but all summer long, in spite of myself, I never was able to build a hot enough fire to even brown biscuits in it. So the oven was useless, but I could put a frying pan and fry bacon on top of it. But anyway, we had no, of course, fresh food because there was no refrigeration on the thing. So we had brought what looked like a week's supply of food for ourselves, and we were supposed to eat with the Boy Scout groups that came through and spent the night at Uraka to supplement the food that we had to eat for ourselves on the thing. So anyway, that was the cabin, and that was our introduction to Uraka. We, of course, the first thing we had to do, we had a calendar that gave us what groups were expected when. I included that with the stuff that the museum made copies of on the thing, so you can see how few people stopped and ate a meal and spent the night at Uraka Cow Camp, because there was, in essence, very little to do there. It had purportedly been a gold mining site at one time, and it's not Uraka Creek. If you look on your maps, you see that the Uraka Cow Camp is not on Uraka Creek, it's on Bonito Creek. And Bonito Creek is about 3 feet wide. It is widest. It has a few beaver dams on it that were up above things where there are small ponds. But the only evidence we had that it had ever been a mining site were 2 roughly 20-foot lengths of very thin-walled, 10-inch, what I call casing pipes. There were 2 joints there that obviously had been used somehow in placer mining, which is the only kind of mining that we had ever heard that was accomplished there on Bonita Creek. But that's the only evidence we ever had that there was placer mining there. But anyway, the only possible thing the mining would have provided for the scouts that came through Uraka was to pan for gold. Well, I'm from Oklahoma, and that's one of the things that I escaped ever learning about was panning for gold in Oklahoma. So there was nothing I could teach him about that. The only other thing about Uraka Cow Camp that was any interest to the scouts that came through was the crash site of the B-24 that flew into the side of Trail Peak above Uraka Cow Camp in 1942. And I had never been there, and the trail that had been made to investigate the crash in 1942 was the only trail up there, and purportedly it was very steep and hard to follow. So that was the only other exciting scenic thing that the scouts could do at Uraka Cow Camp, other than cook their food out in the open. There was no shelter for them to cook their food under or to boil their water to clean their dishes after meals. Anyway, Uraka Cow Camp was a very small, unprovisioned camp. We had no potable water source. We had what was called a Lister bag. It was left over from the Army in the Second World War, which you could put water in, and supposedly the chemicals to purify the water were built into the canvas water bag. But we didn't trust that to have happen, so we had a huge container full of what was called, I can't think of the name of it now, that you purify water with.
Purification tablets?
Yeah, they were tablets to purify the water, put chlorine in the water to purify it. We dump a couple of handfuls of those purification tablets into the Lister bag so that the next group of scouts that came through had some potable water source there at Uraca. So it was a pretty sparse camp on the thing, but that's my recollections of what Uraca was when we first came there. Yes, well, the road from the main camp ended at Crater Lake in 1948. There was no road on up. And Uraca Cow Camp, I might mention, was a small dry camp connected to fishing camp. So I guess my boss, although you don't talk about bosses, or we didn't in Philmont, but my boss, I guess, was the director at Fishing Lodge. So anyway, I've lost my chain of thought again.
It's okay. We're talking about the food trains, the wagon mule trains coming up with food.
Yeah, the road ended at Crater Lake, and so the food that was going to go to fishing camp and supplies like the axe, the single-bitted axe or sledgehammer that I ordered from Rudy the mule skinner on a thing had to be brought to Crater Lodge on a truck. And that with the food that was going to fish camp, Rudy would load up and he used kayak boxes and panniers on his mules, but he'd load up several hundred pounds on each one of his mules of these supplies and take off and ride probably all day with his mules to fish camp. And so my first introduction to Rudy was at Crater Lake. I was going to fish camp, and Rudy was going up taking supplies, so we were hiking, and Rudy had his... So that's when I first met him on the thing. Well, subsequently, several times, I ended up at Crater Lake or at fish camp going the other direction when Rudy, he hauled a couple of times a week stuff from Crater Lake to fish camp, and I'd be making the same trip afoot. It comes to my mind on my days off, which we had a day and a half a month of free time, and I'd try to schedule mine so I could catch a bus into Raton and eat ice cream and go to the movie. Anyway, Rudy would be there, and I would help him pack up his mules and go whichever direction he was going and help him with his mules. I don't think I was a lot of help, but it was company for him and company for me on the thing to come or go. So anyway, I learned a little bit about mule skinning from Rudy on the thing. Finally, do you want to hear some more about mule skinning and at Fishing Lodge? Fishing Lodge at that time, there were, as I recall, there were 4 buildings on what I'm going to call the west side of the Rayado Creek, and then there was the main lodge that was on the opposite side of the creek. And so one of the buildings on the west side was the commissary building, where they kept all the supplies, and the commissary man worked to distribute them to the different camps like Uraka Cow Camp or Porcupine Camp, or the scouts that were spending the night here at Fishing Lodge. So anyway, losing my chain of thought again.
Just talking about the differences between fish camp.
I got to get back on track here.
No problem. You were talking about the 4 buildings on the west side of the creek.
Oh, yes. In addition to the commissary building, of course, there were the horse paddocks, and there were about 4 stalls in the horse paddock on the thing, and that's, of course, where the mules were packed and unpacked, is in the small little paddock area next to the horse stalls on the thing. So there was that building, and then there was another log building that the staff, the camp director and the commissary man and the staff lived in. And then, as I recall, there was one other smaller building. It was a log building that were on that side of the river. And of course, the lodge was the only thing on the other side of the river. Now, you were telling me a while ago that all the buildings except the lodge had been washed away in a flood on the thing. So that's what the camp was like. I do remember one of the times when I was spending the night at fish camp and was bunked up in that big soft feather bed at the main lodge on the thing. Somehow in the main lodge there was a black-footed ferret, and these ferrets, I learned in later years, dined on the chipmunks that there were plenty of around fishing lodge. There are still chipmunks around the lodge.
Oh yeah.
On the thing. Well, I think it's either blackfoot or white-footed ferrets. That's what they lived on, was the chipmunks. So that somehow this ferret had gotten in the main lodge, and he was in the bedroom with me. I'd never seen a ferret before, and I've never seen one since. But I do recall one trait they had. That ferret would start running across the floor when I would move closer to him and accidentally disturb him. He'd actually run up one of the inside log walls, run across part of the ceiling upside down, and go down another wall to the floor. I've never seen anything like it in my life, so that was my introduction to ferrets here at fish camp. I just remembered that.
The last time you were here was 1948, and you came back today. Tell me what that was like to come back into the backcountry for the first time in 70 years.
Well, it seems to me it's grown up a lot. Of course, the road wasn't there, as we've discussed. There was just the trail, and the road doesn't follow in most places what I remember of as the trail. It seems there's a lot more underbrush now than there was back then. And I mentioned to you on the road up, along beside that trail, when it was following close to the top of a ridge, there were deposits on the downside of the rail of iron pyrite, which forms crystals that look like, if you hold them right to the light, look like you found gold crystals. But anyway, we'd always stop and see if we could find a big iron pyrite kissel along beside that trail. And we didn't pass anything on the road today that reminded me of that area where we found the iron pyrite. But apparently there was quite a large outcropping there, and we had a lot of iron pyrite, because I remember we always stopped to see if we could find a piece of, it's called fool's gold, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
Anyway, the difference I see is obviously this lodge is much older. than it was in 1948, although it's remarkably well preserved on that thing. But anyway, that's the biggest difference I see, which is not a lot, but it's not the same route that I used to travel, so I really don't have anything to compare it with.
Okay.
Well, yes, the last week or 10 days I was at Philmont. We didn't have any more campers coming to Eureka Cow Camp, so we shut it down. For the life of me, I say we, I was the only one there, so I shut it down. And of course I would need to tell you one other thing about Eureka Cow Camp on the thing. Sleeping on that bed on that dirt floor was not a very inviting way to spend the night, and so tiring of it after I'd been there 2 or 3 nights, I had a piece of canvas, a tube of canvas that was about 4 or 5 feet in diameter, that was long enough. Now, we didn't have sleeping bags in those days. My sleeping arrangements consisted of first a full-size bed quilt that was folded in half. Over the top of that was a full-size wool blanket. They were pinned together with large safety pins, and the bottom was folded over and pinned up, and that was my sleeping bag. Now, sleeping feather-lined sleeping bags from the Second World War were beginning to become available, but we didn't have a Cabela's or anything to buy sleeping bags from, so unless you could find some place that sold a surplus World War II Arctic sleeping bag, you had to make your own. Anyway, that was my sleeping bag, so I took this tube of canvas, cut myself some poles, and made myself an outdoor bunk in front of the cabin on the thing. I put a roof over it because it rained every afternoon, and I didn't want to get my quote-unquote sleeping bag wet, so I built a tent out of a pup tent half over my bunk in front of the cabin. And so the photograph that I mentioned to you that's in the museum now shows my bunk out in front of the front door of that cabin. So I lived, my nights were spent in that bunk outside the cabin underneath that pup tent half in the rain usually, because really I recall it raining practically every evening, you know, and it was very close to 5 o'clock when it rained. But anyway, that was how I spent the night at Eureka on my homemade bed outside the cabin. I moved back to the camping headquarters on the thing. I was assigned, there were about 3 or 4 of us that were assigned to take groups of scouts through what we called it the Big House at that time. It was never known as the mansions. It's still called the Big House.
It's called the Villa now.
Isn't it? Yeah. Anyway, we had to take groups to learn enough about the Phillips family and their gift to the Boy Scouts there in the house, and we had a few details about the Big House that we know that we passed along to the Scouts. I hope they were the truth. But anyway, my job was a couple of times a day to work with the other 2 or 3 boys and take scouts through the Big House on the thing. which after being all summer at Uraka Cow Camp was really a dull thing. Anyway, it was interesting about the family and about the big house, but that was my job for the last few days at Philmont. Do you want to hear about our young man that we decided to give a small fright in the big house?
Sure.
Well, the 3 or 4 of us that were assigned to take groups of scouts through the big house, a couple of days after I started, a young man who was a camper that either got here before the rest of his group did, but he had nothing to do, so they said, why don't you go with the boys and help them show scouts through the big house? So he was a camper, but he was kind of assigned to go with our group. Well, unfortunately, it turned out he was kind of a bossy young man, and the best way I can describe him, he was quite full of himself. Anyway, he accompanied us, and we took groups of scouts through the big house. And later after we'd taken the last group through the big house, the 2 or 3 of us staff members that were assigned to that task decided that it would be kind of fun to maybe give him a little scare. So we were messing around in the big house, seeing what we could find because we had nothing to do. And we found a closet right inside the front door that had about 40 what they call electrical circuit breakers. And they controlled all the lighting and the plugs for electricity throughout the whole mansion. Well, about that time, in the main room of the big house is a player piano, a grand piano that's a player piano. That was new stuff to us. We all grew up in my age with jukeboxes, but I'd never seen a grand piano before, nor had most people. A grand player piano. So we said, gee, we're going to get that young man and play a joke on him tonight. So after it got dark and after we had dinner, we contacted the young man who was staying in the camping area and said, we have to go over to the big house because somebody's reported that there's a light on in the big house. Do you want to go with us? And so he, of course, heartily agreed. He had nothing else to do. So we walked over to the big house. We had our flashlights with us, and we said, now, the power's off in the big house. We don't have any lights in the big house, so we have to use our flashlights on the thing. So anyway, we'd arranged among ourselves that one of us went ahead, not me, but one of the other guys, and we had marked the circuit breaker that controlled the player piano. So when the rest of us brought the young man in the house, we went through the front door, and to your right is the big opening down into the large living room. And it's kind of a spooky place at night when all you've got is your flashlight. We told the young man, why don't you go down, and maybe that light is coming from the gazebo. There it's on the other side of the big room. Why don't you go down and see what the light is, see if there's anybody down there. So he took his flashlight, went into the big room. Well, one of us had slipped into the circuit breaker room, and when we gave him enough time to get down in there, he flipped the circuit breaker. The piano we had set up with a spooky piano tune to play. Suddenly the piano starts playing itself while he's down in this dark, spooky room. The last we saw of him ever was he was running across the front yard back to the camping area. So we should have been ashamed of ourselves, but anyway, it was fun at the time. It was word of mouth. I grew up in a little town called Duncan, Oklahoma, which had a population of maybe 10,000 people. It was a company town for Halliburton Oil Well Cementing Company. And one of my classmates, when I was a sophomore in high school, was a young man named Bob Dunn. And Bob had worked here at Philmont. How he knew about it, but he was in the Boy Scout troop I was in. Now, mind you, this all happened in 1947, and the Second World War was just over with, and so I don't know how Bob had contacted Philmont and became a staff member, but in 47 he was a staff member. We were buddies, and that summer of 47 he got to tell me about Philmont. So I learned from him how to apply to Philmont. I just received my Eagle Scout badge and was still very active in the scouting troop. And mind you, we only had one scout leader in the whole town, and he was a World War I veteran that was the postal deliverer for the whole town on the thing. He was our scoutmaster, and somehow through him, and I'm sure it had to do, George Bullock, who I mentioned was the director of Philmont at that time, was from Oklahoma. So it must have been some contact between Bob Dunn and his family and George Bullock that he got a job at Philmont, and he told me about it, and I got all the information from him and applied, and they accepted me. I still have the letters of acceptance from Philmont. Somehow, I've lost practically everything I ever had in my life over the years, being in the military and such, but I somehow held on a lot of this Boy Scout stuff. So I have my acceptance letters and my application acknowledgement from the ranch and this and that, which is all now available at the museum, the Philmont Museum here. Anyway,
neat.
That's how I came aboard. That after we spent the night at the old Kit Carson house, I had never been up in the mountains. They're not, the mountains in Oklahoma are only a couple of thousand feet high. It's pretty flat country. I'd never been in the mountains. And I might add, and that reminds me, in Oklahoma you have a lot of flies because a lot of it's ranch country. And I found, and flies always bothered me when I was out in the open. When I came to Philmont, I found out if you, in the mountains at high altitudes, you step into the shade, it's a lot cooler than it is in the sun, and the flies don't like that. So the flies leave you when you step into the shade, and that really impressed me. I said, here's a place where I can get away from the flies.
That should be our new motto. What do you think? Place where you can get away from the flies. That's pretty neat.
Yeah, somehow they assigned, and the next thing I remember is going up to Crater Lake on my way with my partner to Uraka Cow Camp. But that we had to stop at Fish Camp before we went to Uraka Cow Camp.
Okay. You came up here and then went back down through.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, that involves the mule skinner Rudy again. Somehow I ended up at Crater Lake at the same time Rudy was going on his days off, but he had a loaded a bunch of stuff he needed to take to fish camp, and they, for some reason, needed it in a hurry, but he wanted to go into town to take his day off. It was some family matter or something. So anyway, he said, "You've been with me around the mules enough." He said, "They're already packed up and ready to go. Would you take the mules to fish camp?" Well, I'd been around enough and was dumb enough to say, "Oh, sure, I know how to take care of mules." Well, among other things, thank goodness, Rudy used a bullwhip to run that 6 or 7 big mule, which is a pretty big mule train. He never hit the mules with the whip, but it popped a lot. So on one of the trips when I was with him, he taught me how to use the bullwhip a little bit, and he handed it to me. Said, "Take this mules and this stuff up to fish camp, and when I come back from my vacation, I'll go up to fish camp and get them and bring them back to Crater Lake for my next trip." So what can be simpler than that? I'd been on the trail from Crater Lake to fish camp several times. So anyway, I started back with that mule train. Well, I did real good till I got to the place I told you about that was on the trail where we had the guying of the iron pyrite.
Down by Beaubien there?
Is it?
Yeah, it was down by Beaubien.
Well, I got to that point, and if you've ever driven horses or even burros, I've seen burros do it, they're all tied with a rope from the back end of the crosstree saddle back to the halter of the burro or animal behind them on the thing. That's the way I had the mules, or Rudy had the mules strung out. Well, I had 6 or 7 mules in that thing. About the 3rd mule decided that he would there was a tree a couple inches in diameter growing right at the edge of the trail, and all the animals in front of him went on the trail side of that tree, but he decided to stick his head on the down slope side of that tree. Well, his halter's tied to the saddle in front of him, so his head is pinned up against that tree, and the halter rope is stretched tight because the 2 or 3 mules in front of him are straining and pulling because he's stopped. I couldn't get the rope undone because the mules in front are pulling so hard I can't get the knot undone. Now I've got the couple of mules behind me. They want to go, and so they're crowding up the trail trying to push their way around it. I've got a couple in front pulling, 2 behind pushing, and one of them snubbed up against the tree and can't move. So after a couple of minutes of silence, and all I'm standing there with a bullwhip in my hand, well, there was nothing I could do to get that knot undone. All I had was a pocket knife. I felt like if I somehow let the 2 mules in front go, they'd take off running, and I'd spend the next 2 or 3 hours tying up the ones that hadn't run away and finding the rest of them. And I'm thinking, what a mess I've got on my hands. So finally I worked around and got them in such a position I was able to get the mules undone. And about 200 yards, and got them hooked back together, packed trail, I came to an open meadow, and this is the meadow I tried to identify with you. Large open meadow, and the trail went around one side of the meadow, but there was a shortcut that Rudy had pointed out to me one time that just cut off a short period of time, but it went up the other side of the meadow. It was a pretty steep trail, he told me, but I thought, that's a shortcut. It's getting dark because of all the time I spent trying to get these animals unraveled on the thing, and I sure don't want to be working with these animals in the dark, so I'll take the shortcut. Well, I started this string of mules up this trail, and the trail ended up in a shale bank that had real steep sides, and it was nothing but loose shale. Well, the mules are walking in the bottom of that. I'm walking up on the shale side, and suddenly my feet slipped, went out from under me, and my feet went under the belly of about the third mule. He laid down promptly on me, and his kayak boxes, which are diamond hitched to him, are laying across my legs. I can't move, and this mule's laying on me, and although I'm yelling for him to get up and everything, he's of course not paying any attention to him, as mules are wont to do. Anyway, after about 10 or 15 minutes of laying there, I thought, if I can't get this mule up, they're going to find my cold body tomorrow because I'll freeze tonight. And of course, I've got a couple of mules in front of him that are still pulling, trying to get up the hill. Got a couple of mules behind me again that are trying to stomp on me on the thing. And I'm pinned to the ground by this mule. Anyway, thank goodness Rudy had given me his bullwhip. I'm too close to use the whip on the mule, and I don't know if he'd have paid any attention to it anyway. But it had bullwhips in those days had a steel handle underneath the leather that's wrapped around it. And I thought, I'm going to hit him up around the head until I can get his attention and maybe get him up. So finally I had enough strength and I could reach his head with the handle of that bullwhip, and I beat him up around the head till finally I got his attention and got him to get up, and I got away. I got here to fish camp well after dark after those two experiences. So anyway, that's how I was learning about what it's like to be a mule skinner. I mentioned to you when we were at Crater Lake, the only bad thing that happened is we had one of the scout leaders for a group had a heart attack. But the only other thing, one of the guides, he was up above on the Rayado River where the trail follows the Rayado north of Fish Camp here. And he somehow he was riding a horse, and he wasn't with a group of scouts, but the horse slid off the trail on the shale bank, and he and the horse went down the shale bank, and he put some pretty deep scratches on his legs. He was wearing short pants. Incidentally, boys, when I was that age, didn't wear short pants very much, and most of us wore long pants because that's what you wear in the mountains, and particularly if you're wrestling with horses or burros or something. But he had short pants on. Well, that taught us all, if you're going to do any riding or even slide down on some of these shale banks, you better be wearing long pants or you're going to end up scarred up a little bit. But all we had in the way of disinfectant in those days, we had mercurochrome and had iodine. Well, mercurochrome was the preferred method of treating a wound because iodine hurt.
It did.
For dinner tonight about shoes and boots. We didn't have mountain boots. We had tennis shoes and shoes, leather shoes like I have on today for boots. And you could, of course, buy boots at Sears and Montgomery Ward. But those were big, heavy leather boots, and in my part of Oklahoma, which was oil country, we had the steel-toed what we called driller's boots. Heavy as lead with the steel toe and the heavy uppers. They were lace-up shoestrings, I remember, and it took you 10 minutes to unloose to get your foot in, and took you another 10 minutes to tighten up all the laces to where your boots were on. But anyway, after the mule I was loading, stepped on my steel-toed boot and crushed it on the thing. I thought he'd cut my toes off. I finally he was in a corral and had crowded me. And I hadn't paid any attention to Rudy told me not to do that. But I typically didn't listen at that age, I guess, when he told me. He told me later that he told me.
Yeah.
Anyway, after I got my foot out of the boot, the steel toe, when he stepped on, it must have been good protection from somebody rolling a piece of heavy steel pipe against it, but it wasn't any good to keep a mule from crushing it, because it all spread out, and I had steel toes sticking out of either side of the leather up around my toes. Well, we didn't have duct tape in those days. Duct tape would have solved that problem. I could just wrap my foot up, so I had to wrap rags around the toe of that boot the rest of the time I was at Philmont to keep my shoes from coming apart on me. I'm trying to get used to the fact that, of course, we had no girls at Philmont in those days. There was no affiliation with the Girl Scouts or anything else, so there were no girls. And of course, most of the staff members that worked here, like I mentioned, were World War II veterans when they're in their 20s. But the rest of us that were all high school students, we just started dating and this and that. And I was telling Julie last night, as a young girl, she was at the Cimarron Sita camp, which was a girls' camp in 1948. And we're a bunch of 15, 16, 17-year-old boys that hadn't seen a girl for a couple of months. And I found out that my friend that got me into the Philmont mode from Duncan, Oklahoma, Bob Dunn, was the ranger at Cimarron Sito. Well, Cimarron Sito is up on the mountain above Cimarron Sita, and I'd heard a rumor. Oh, there's our 5 o'clock rain.
That's right, it's coming.
I'd heard a rumor that somehow he'd obtained a tripod and the telescope from a surveying transit. And if you went to Cimarron Sito, which was a one-man camp, trail camp at that time, and my friend Bob Dunn was the ranger there on the thing, that you could look through the telescope and actually see a girl. So on one of my days off, I was only, the summer session's only roughly 3 months long.
Yeah. So
one of my day and a half off, instead of going to Raton and enjoying the city pleasures, I hiked all the way from Uraka Cow Camp to Cimarron Sito, so I could look through the transit and actually see a nice-looking girl, which never happened. I got there and all the girls stayed inside that day for some reason, or it was a rumor that there were actually girls there. But anyway, I didn't get to see a girl on that trip and spent my vacation walking. Well, I did one of the stupid things. I told my daughter I wasn't going to tell this story because if any mothers of boys that come to Philmont see this, they might put the kibosh on their son going. because it's one of the dumbest things that you could do as a young man. But during the last few days I was here at Philmont at the ranching headquarters on the thing. I didn't have anything to do that day, didn't have any groups of scouts to take through the big house, so I'd never been to the Tooth of Time. The closest I'd been is at Crater Lake, looking up at it. So I decided I'm just going to take off and go up the trail from camping headquarters to the Tooth of Time. So I got up there and found out there's not much of a view from where the trail goes past the top of the Tooth of Time because the Tooth of Time's in the way. So I thought, gee, if I walk out a little ways, I can look down and actually see what's down below. I can see Crater Lake and everything. So I got down on all fours and started crawling down the face of Tooth of Time. Well, I got down about 10 or 15 feet, and suddenly I realized that not only am I slipping down the steep front edge of the Tooth of Time, but my clothes didn't have any friction and were sliding on the rock, and every time I moved I slid a little further down the front of the thing. So I thought, well, if I dig my toes in, well, I still had the smashed up boot that the mule had stepped on, and steel-toed boots aren't very flexible, and I couldn't get my toes hooked on that rock to move myself backwards, so every time I wiggled or moved, I slid a little further down the front of the Tooth of Time. So I thought, well, this is it. On I finally managed to get my shirt off, and it was still tied to me, so I didn't lose it down the front of the Tooth of Time, but I got my shirt off to where I could get my sleeves off and get my bare arms out, which had enough friction against the rock where I could scoot myself backwards and save myself from going off the front of the Tooth of Time. So anyway, my daughter thinks that's a great story. I think it's a study in stupidity. But anyway.
I agree with your daughter. That's a great story.
That is a great story.
And they can always edit it out, Dad.
That's right.
So no mothers see it.
Teachable moment. That's what we call those today. Teachable moments.
Yes.
Guys, learn something there. Don't slide off the front of the
To
tree.
the time. Meet Chuck?
It's time to roll it up.
Probably.
I've been listening to my friend for a year.
You good with that?
I'm good. 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 Good.